June 11th, 1776, Philadelphia. The rented rooms on the second floor of Jacob Graff's new brick house at 7th and Market Streets are stifling. The summer air, heavy with the humidity of the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers, is a foul miasma of city life, the stench of tanneries, the smoke of coal fires, the sharp tang of horse manure rising from the unpaved street below. Inside, a tall, slender man, just 33 years old, with reddish hair and a freckled complexion, stands over a portable writing desk of his own design. He is Thomas Jefferson, a delegate from Virginia, and he is staring at a blank sheet of fine, cream-colored Dutch paper. He has just been handed an assignment that is, in the eyes of the British Crown, an act of high treason, punishable by hanging, drawing, and quartering. He is not being asked to design a fortification or to calculate the trajectory of a cannonball. He is being asked to forge a weapon, one made not of iron or steel, but of ink and ideas. He must find the words to justify the annihilation of a continent's allegiance to its king, to explain to the entire world why 13 colonies are about to declare themselves a new, independent nation, willing to risk everything in a war against the single greatest military power on earth. The weapon he is about to build must be sharp enough to sever the psychological bonds of a century and a half of history, and powerful enough to rally a divided populace to a cause that most still find terrifying, and many simply insane. The central tactical challenge was not by this point a military one. The war was already here. Blood had been spilled, cannons fired, cities besieged. The problem was one of definition. For over a year since the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the colonies had been in a state of armed, open, yet undefined rebellion. They were fighting, but for what? For a redress of grievances? For their rights as Englishmen? For a return to the salutary neglect that had allowed them to flourish before the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties? The tactical and strategic inadequacy of this position had become fatally clear. The old technology of protest, petitions, boycotts, and appeals to common law had failed utterly. This old tech was the argument from history. It was the plea of a subject to his sovereign, based on the 1689 English Bill of Rights and the 1215 Magna Carta. These were powerful documents, but they had a critical design flaw for the American situation. They defined the rights granted by a monarch to his subjects. They were, fundamentally, a list of permissions. The colonists used this tool, most notably in the Olive Branch Petition of July 1775. It was a masterpiece of the old doctrine, addressed directly to King George III, professing loyalty and begging him to intervene against his designing and wicked ministers. But the king had refused to even read it. On August 23, 1775, he had issued his Proclamation of Rebellion, declaring the colonies to be in an open and avowed rebellion and calling on all loyal subjects to suppress it. This was followed by Parliament's Prohibitory Act in December, which effectively blockaded all 13 colonial ports, declared American ships prizes of war, and legalized the impressment of their sailors into the Royal Navy. This was not a tax law. It was a declaration of economic and total war. The old tech of petition was useless against a sovereign who had already declared you an outlaw, outside his protection. The colonists were in the absurd, untenable position of fighting a war for reconciliation with a king who was actively waging war against them. This intellectual vacuum was a strategic liability. George Washington, attempting to forge a professional army out of farm boys and militia, had no coherent cause to offer them. The men in the Continental Congress, operating as a de facto government, had no legal basis upon which to seek foreign alliances, and without an alliance with France, their cause was doomed. The problem was clear. They needed a new technology of thought. They could no longer argue as aggrieved Englishmen. They had to argue as a sovereign people, appealing not to the king's law, but to a higher law. The intellectual ammunition for this new weapon was being shipped from the philosophical battlefields of the European Enlightenment. This new tech was the doctrine of natural rights. Its chief engineer was the Englishman John Locke, who in his 2 treatises of government in 1689 had provided the master blueprint. Locke had inverted the entire structure of power. He argued that government was not a divine mandate from God to a king, but a social contract created by the people for the people. The people, he argued, were born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property. They voluntarily formed a government and gave it just powers for the sole purpose of protecting those rights. And in Locke's most radical conclusion, if a government failed in that duty, if it became a long train of abuses and sought to put the people under absolute despotism, the people had not just the right, but the duty to alter or abolish it. This was the intellectual explosive the colonists needed. But an idea, like a pile of gunpowder, is inert without a fuse. That fuse was lit in January 1776 by a failed corset maker and immigrant named Thomas Paine. His pamphlet, Common Sense, was a 47-page incendiary device. It was not a high-minded philosophical treatise. It was a brutal, brilliant, and visceral assault on the very idea of monarchy. Paine attacked King George himself, calling him the royal brood of Great Britain. He ridiculed the absurdity of an island ruling a continent, and he, for the first time, reframed the entire conflict. This was not a civil war. This was a war for independence. Common Sense sold over 150,000 copies in a matter of months, read aloud in taverns and town squares, transforming the common sense of the people from reconciliation to separation. This new tech had its first field test just weeks earlier in Jefferson's own Virginia. On May 15, 1776, Virginia's convention had instructed its delegates in Philadelphia to vote for independence. Then, a planter named George Mason drafted a Declaration of Rights for Virginia's new constitution. It was the first time Locke's philosophy had been forged into an American state document. Mason wrote that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. This was the prototype. It was the successful test firing of the new weapon. Now, the Continental Congress needed to build the production model. The men tasked with this were a study in contrasts, the Committee of Five. First, there was the engine, John Adams of Massachusetts. Short, stout, brilliant, vain, and colossally argumentative, Adams was the Atlas of Independence. He had been pushing for this moment for over a year, battling the cautious and the conciliatory with sheer stubborn force of will. He was, as one delegate put it, obnoxious and disliked, but he was the indispensable man. Second, there was the sage, Dr. Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. At 70, he was the most famous American in the world, a scientist, inventor, and diplomat whose wit was as sharp as his mind. He was a natural editor, a man of profound wisdom and worldly pragmatism, who understood that the goal of the document was not just to be right, but to be persuasive. Third, there was the ballast, Roger Sherman of Connecticut. A former shoemaker who had become a respected lawyer, Sherman was a Puritan in his morals and a pragmatist in his politics. He was known for his common sense and lack of polish, a man who would ground the committee's rhetoric in reality. Fourth, there was the skeptic, Robert Livingston of New York. Wealthy, aristocratic, and deeply cautious, Livingston represented the powerful, undecided merchant interests of the middle colonies. His presence was a political necessity to ensure that the document did not so alienate the moderates that it split the colonies rather than uniting them. And finally, there was the pen. Thomas Jefferson. At 33, he was one of the youngest delegates and by far the quietest. He was no orator. In the noisy, passionate debates of the Congress, Jefferson was known to sit in silence, listening. But those who knew him, like John Adams, understood that his silence was not emptiness. Jefferson was a true polymath, a man of the Enlightenment, an architect who designed his own home at Monticello, a musician who practiced his violin for hours, a scientist who meticulously recorded the weather 3 times a day, an agronomist, a paleontologist, and one of the finest legal minds in Virginia. He was less a politician than an intellectual system, a man who believed with religious fervor in the power of reason and the empire of the mind. And he was a man defined by a profound, agonizing contradiction. He was an idealist who dreamed of liberty, and a planter who owned over 150 human beings. The man who would write that all men are created equal was at that very moment a master of slaves, living off their forced labor. This paradox was not lost on his contemporaries, and it would haunt his life and his legacy, the gap between the world he imagined and the world he inhabited. The choice of Jefferson to be the primary author was a masterstroke of political and psychological management, engineered by John Adams. When the committee met, Adams insisted that Jefferson write the first draft. As Adams later recalled, Jefferson was reluctant. He argued that Adams, as the senior, more prominent figure, should do it. Adams refused. "Reason first," he said, "you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business." This was a tactical masterstroke. Independence, until now, had been seen as a radical New England cause. By placing a Virginian, the representative of the oldest, wealthiest, and largest colony, as its author, Adams made it a truly continental movement. His second reason was more personal. "Reason second," Adams said, "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise." And his third reason, the one that truly mattered, was a recognition of Jefferson's unique technology. "Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." Jefferson, trapped by Adams's logic, finally conceded. He retreated to his rented rooms, away from the noise of the State House. He set up his small mahogany laptop, a portable writing desk he had designed for his travels. He had no library to consult, only his own mind and a few essential documents, a copy of George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights and his own draft preamble for the Virginia Constitution. His task was not to invent, it was to distill, to synthesize, to capture the common sense of the subject and give it a voice that was at once rational, legal, and transcendent. He was not just writing a declaration, he was writing the argument that would give birth to a nation.